Hello, everyone, and thanks to the PERC team for putting on our PERC Symposium this year. My name's Steve Webb, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Institute for Food Security, or GIFS, at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. And a little bit of background about GIFS. We're a public-private partnership that was established in 2012, and our founding partners are Nutrien, the province of Saskatchewan, and the University of Saskatchewan. And our mission is to discover, develop, and deliver innovative solutions for the production of globally sustainable foods. And for us, sustainability has three important legs: economic, environmental, and social. We serve as AG's innovation catalyst, connecting the ag and food ecosystem and advancing innovation by bridging the gap from the lab bench all the way to the field and commercialization to deliver resilient and sustainable food security for all stakeholders. Our panel discussion today, The Digital Horizon, Carbon Opportunity in Ag, is the capstone session for the first day of the PERC Symposium. I'm joined by Candace Laing, Vice President, Sustainability and Stakeholder Relations at Nutrien, Michelle Nutting, Manager, Agricultural Sustainability, and Michael Nemeth, a Senior Advisor, Environmental and Agricultural Sustainability from Nutrien as well. We know carbon markets are expanding. We've seen the public reports of, despite the pandemic and reduced economic activity and lower emissions in 2020, carbon markets have hit record highs of over 230 billion pounds. And again, consecutive years of growth. And it means there's an increase in the number of emission permits and the price for which they're being exchanged. So there's a real market for carbon. And we can comfortably say that we'll continue to see carbon markets grow for the foreseeable future. We're also seeing an ever-increasing role in recognition that agriculture is not only a growing part of the carbon market, but we're also recognizing that agriculture is part of the solution and not the problem to the big challenges that we face, like climate change and adaptation. Our panel today is going to focus around strategy, policy, and opportunities and real on-the-ground experience for the implementation of carbon and carbon markets in agricultural production systems. And I'm going to invite Candace to give an introduction and an overview of Nutrien's ESG goals and objectives. Candace?
Thanks, Steve. And just actually thank you for the opportunity for Nutrien to be part of the symposium today, and specifically to talk about the carbon opportunity in agriculture. I'm sure everybody has heard a lot. There is a lot of talk, a lot of dialogue around carbon and what we can do to not only reduce but sequester carbon in our soils. And so hopefully what we can share today brings some perspective, because we have been, as you say, working hard on the ground with growers on a path forward to really deliver on what is this opportunity we have in agriculture. But maybe I'll just start for the benefit of everybody. Hopefully Nutrien is familiar to you, but if not, we are the product of the merger of the Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan and Agrium. We are just coming up on being 4 years old, and as Nutrien, we're the world's largest provider of crop input services and solutions. So not only do we produce fertilizer, but work with more than 500,000 growers in several countries, bringing everything they need from agronomic advice, crop inputs, and services so they can sustainably produce for a growing world. So on the topic of sustainably producing enough food for a growing world, and close to your heart, Steve, and GIFS, when we talk about food security, the most important piece, I think, in the global context of this is we used to talk about food security, and then we used to talk about climate and looking at solutions separately for some of these big issue challenges we have globally. And the reality is we can no longer speak of those in silos or solve for them independently. And that is definitely a new level to the challenge we have in moving forward with food security. I say we have to add to it. We have to say we have to solve for food and climate and nature and water security all together. And these things are being looked at interdependently, which is actually a good thing. And I'll explain why in a minute. but it's really also how the UN Sustainable Development Goals are looking at these challenges, which is a good thing, because we don't want unintended consequences. We don't want, straightforward solutions for climate that actually threaten productivity in agriculture, because then we're no further ahead and we'll wipe out more carbon sinks that we desperately still need to preserve and protect. So our solutions need to bring that all together. And so I just want to share a little bit about how Nutrien has really dug into this and stepped up our ambition, and as many others have as well. But we launched earlier this year what we call our Feeding the Future plan. And our Feeding the Future plan has a set of 2030 commitments, because we have to come up with solutions this decade to really meet the urgency, which I'm sure many have heard, given the recent reports you referenced, Steve, around climate and other key challenges. So 2 of our 2030 commitments I want to share with you, and they really link to the discussion today. One is we have an ambition to scale sustainable and productive agriculture on 75 million acres globally. So that's a big number and a big task, but that means we find solutions to maintain and increase productivity while ensuring grower resilience, while we're getting carbon outcomes, water outcomes, biodiversity supportive practices, and it all works in tandem. Where we're starting and what will ladder up into that 75 million acres is an investment in launching and scaling a carbon program with our growers. And we'll talk a lot about that today. There's a great kind of revenue stream that can help scale practice changes. We bring sort of an end-to-end whole acre solution, leveraging practices, products, technology, and the digital we need to get the evidence out of the farm level to really deliver on that opportunity. That's all on top of our own commitment to reduce our footprint as Nutrien and our inside the plant gate emissions. But I share that because everybody needs to be doing that in the food and ag value chain, and it's why there's a lot of pressure on growers to actually deliver on the carbon opportunity. And that's because their downstream partners are really trying to address emissions in their value chain. And so those food companies come right back to the grower and are putting pressure and demands on the farm for reduced emissions, sequestered emissions at the farm level. And so we're on the other side of the grower trying to help deliver those outcomes as well. So lots of ambition around climate, ultimately leading to a 2050 net zero world, or net zero nature positive world for agriculture. But we have a big task ahead of us, I think, to make a real step change and some progress between now and 2030. So my whole family farms, and I can really appreciate how in my lifetime we've transformed agriculture. And so I like to recognize that and just say we need to continue transforming agriculture and do what we've done, but do it again. So with that, I think I'll pause, but there is this sense of urgency and real need. And I think your model with GIFS, Steve, in terms of discover, develop, deliver, this urgency to get solutions to growers is just such an important part of our path forward. So happy to share more, but I'll pass it back to you for now.
Terrific, Candace, and thank you. And again, I think one of the things that is super important, the point I want to hit on is it's personal, it's family, it's how the connection that we have, that we're all part of the opportunity here to create solutions. So we're going to go into our panel discussion, and I'm actually going to start with Candace, just as a high-level introductory question. Then, Mike and Michelle are not off the hook, just if anybody was wondering if it was just going to be Candace and I talking. But again, we'll start with Candace. But again, Mike and Michelle, please feel free to jump in and add, what opportunities do you see for agriculture in the carbon space? And Candace, you talked about a lot in your introductory comments about the role agriculture plays and the position, the unique position in the of climate mitigation and carbon reduction and environmental sustainability that growers are in? What other opportunities do you see?
Well, maybe I'll just frame, because I think this is important and it has been a shift in the last number of years. So the urgency around climate change, and I just want to come back to 2015 and the Paris Agreement, which was really that watershed moment where we're looking at climate science and engaging all nations on this path forward. And there's a role for corporates and all sectors to execute on that. But what was interesting at the time is agriculture wasn't really referenced strongly in 2015, but it is being referenced now and looked at. And to your point, Steve, there's reference to we're part of the problem, but we're part of the solution as well. And the interesting thing about what's happening this fall, actually in a month at COP26, the big climate meeting in Glasgow, is that not only will agriculture be part of the discussion, but what really opens up the opportunity here for agriculture is the potential of the ratification of what's called Article 6, which is leaning into carbon finance, which is probably this missing lever to scale practice changes. And carbon finance just means the collaboration is allowed where we could actually have the infrastructure and mechanics in play that lead to a global carbon voluntary market. And that brings the opportunity then to deliver on natural climate solutions from agriculture to generate offsets from the farm level. And there's a lot of interest if you can buy offsets from farmers and nature. And we think there's going to be good demand for those. And that's the pathway that we're focused on trying to execute on with our growers.
Terrific. Thank you. Michelle, what do you see that's inspiring you in this space, this new opportunity space that Candace has outlined?
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to build a little bit on some of Candace's opening comments. And I would say what's most inspiring to me is the partnerships that I'm seeing come together to try to solve this challenge for agriculture and for the climate. So just in our own experience, as we launched into having a carbon program with our farmers, we also brought in a number of partners into the program in North America. And I would say that if I look back at where this all started, as Candace mentioned, a lot of it had to do with food companies that were looking at their own carbon footprints and trying to understand how they could have influence in reducing the carbon footprints related to a lot of the food products that they purchased. Agriculture, when it comes to the farmers and the industry, we weren't as quick off the mark. And now that we have stepped into actually having programs with our farm customers to understand the impacts of their management practices in terms of reducing emissions and increasing soil organic carbon, we're really seeing that we're being able to bring those other supply chain partners along with us. And what we're able to bring to the table is that deep understanding of farming practices and the relationship with the grower. And it all has to fit together. So while they might be on the initial demand side or the beginning, the front end of this whole chain, it really comes back to what's happening on the farm. And so for me, the most inspiring thing has been seeing food companies, other supply chain partners in terms of other crop input companies, the environmental groups. Everybody's really seeing the potential and pulling together. And there's a lot of questions to be answered as we work through what's the right way to measure, monitor, and have real credibility in this space and be able to deliver that outcome from better farming practices. But it's really been amazing in the last 3 years, I would say, just the evolution and the pace of evolution as these groups work together to try to improve the opportunity on farms for them to participate in a carbon market in the future. So there's lots of excitement, lots changing in this space, Steve.
Thank you, Michelle. And that's really encouraging to see diverse stakeholders pull together and rally around an opportunity. Mike, I'm going to go to you next because I know our team of scientists and researchers in the PERC program are really keen to hear from you on how has your pilot study shed light on any technical gaps in terms of measurement and modeling? Michelle mentioned verification. We're excited to hear from the boots on the ground, so to speak, experience that you guys have had here at Nutrien as well.
Thanks, Steve. I think being able to pilot this with growers, and again, that's the mechanisms of trying to bring solutions down to the field level for growers to be able to meaningfully participate in this. It's been interesting and it's had some challenges. I think the biggest one is translating, I would say, the protocols into something that's more meaningful from the farm, whether it's agronomic practices that from a scientific or protocol-based language and thinking make sense in calculations. They may not make sense in terms of what actually happens at a farm level, whether it's taking into consideration the economics of fertilizer prices, the timing of fertilizer inputs, and just the logistics that go into managing a farm and the various interconnected practices that happen on the farm. So they don't always mesh, but having the protocols and the willingness to accept, I guess, different forms of evidence or different types of activities that can still produce a beneficial outcome, but maybe weren't thought of or integrated into the initial protocol development and scientific thinking. It's probably the biggest one.
Okay, great. Thanks. So, Mike, back to you again. In terms of the experience with the pilot program that you guys have been running in, the fact that it was oversubscribed, I think also shows the willingness of growers to participate. I think that's wonderful news. What do you think we're not doing that we should be doing in this space, and what would you tell our audience?
I think one thing, there's two things that come to mind. The first is we probably need to be engaging more with having more engaged discussions with the farmer. And so I think what that means is there's been a lot of policy and a lot of science, a lot of development into these protocols and understanding how to measure and monitor and track the opportunities around carbon and what that means. But sometimes it's more complicated than what's written out in a protocol. And so again, to engage those farmers in both education and awareness so that they understand what's happening, what they're being asked and why, and then be able to hear them from their perspective and understand what works and what doesn't and why that doesn't work, because to truly bring solutions at a scalable level is going to need kind of that engaged farmer approach to be able to be integrated into what's eventually applied long term. And then the other one I would say is figuring out, carbon's the starting point, as Candace kind of mentioned. There's going to be probably a push in years to come around things like soil health outcomes or water or biodiversity outcomes. But specifically, carbon is the kind of the big shiny object right now. But how do we take looking at carbon and then realize the co-benefits with carbon? So take that more ecosystem thinking, whether it's ecosystem services, models, and protocols, but thinking of those co-benefits that come with carbon, like soil health, water infiltration, biodiversity, those practices that kind of relate to those. I think there needs to be some more specific thinking and co-benefits related to carbon specifically.
Great, thanks, Mike. And again, one of the things that I think what we've heard from Candace, yourself, and Michelle is the system it's complex, but what you're building is scalable and it reduces the complication of looking at this system. And I think that's really important. The next question, I'm going to kind of throw it to Michelle, but it's a free-for-all, as much of a free-for-all we can have in our virtual world. What barriers do you see in fully expanding and realizing this opportunity, not only here in Canada, but also on a global scale? Like 75 million acres, like Candace mentioned at the beginning, is likely not going to be in the province of Saskatchewan alone. So what do you see the challenges as we go global?
Well, Steve, I think one of the barriers is really, this is relatively new for agriculture, having a carbon market. And we don't really have a common approach in carbon markets across Canada. We have both voluntary market opportunities as well as regulated markets like the Alberta market. And there's a lot of development work to be done in the provinces in Western Canada and Eastern Canada around their own viewpoints on carbon markets and the engagement of agriculture in that. And the voluntary market space is also going through a lot of evolution right now. I think one of the biggest challenges is having protocols that Mike referred to that are robust and give us a credible, high integrity carbon impact, but are also implementable at the farm level, so that we are able to demonstrate that taking the correct action has a measured outcome in terms of carbon. And so I think, there's still some evolution to happen in terms of how we employ our digital data tools, remote sensed imagery, that sort of information to help really make those quantifications credible and verifiable. And then having that framework, whether it's a national framework across Canada, whether it's a framework that starts with some of those more global organizations that are also going to be present in the conversations around Article 6. We really need solid framework governance that considers what this looks like at the field level when you're engaging with a farmer. So those are some of the challenges and barriers that I see.
Great. Candace or Mike, do you want to build on Michelle's comments?
Sure. I'll just build on them a bit, because I don't want to get too much into the weeds because it's overwhelming. But when we are looking at the protocols, and to Michelle's point, we need to maintain a high level of integrity in what we can provide as evidence, especially if we're feeding, these gains into an offset market. So those offsets have to be high quality and have high integrity. The challenge is, when you look at, part of our business is manufacturing. We can put valves on everything and count everything just so clearly and crisply and easily. Then you go over to a biological system and soils and nature, which we have this high level of inconsistency and high level of variability. But you kind of take that same mindset across from manufacturing into, soil, and things don't compute, and you very quickly erode value for the grower. If we have to do soil sampling in the protocols, that's really just so extensive and too expensive that it becomes not worth it in the end, right? And the time it takes in all of this. So I think that challenge of working through and iterating with partners and those that are developing and shaping the rules and protocols to use, that's the work that really we need to grind through and just push through in order to scale. So it is definitely a challenge and a barrier that we are still working on to find a way, where soil testing is economic at the farm level and works. And, is that modeling or sampling, or, a field, I always say, is different from one corner to the other, but in reality, it's different, like 3 feet apart, you take a soil sample. And so this is really the on the ground work we're just pushing through in our pilots this year and next.
Terrific. Mike, you mentioned the important role of producers in implementing this, and I was wondering, maybe going to the kind of our next thought and question is, what support does this opportunity require from various players, stakeholders? You mentioned the producers. Michelle mentioned what's inspiring is how different people are coming together, like NGOs and the regulation piece and the governance piece of this that Candace had mentioned, supply chain, the end users. What do you see, Mike, from your experience with the pilot? Who can help you?
Really, from my perspective, I think for something like this, it has to be collaborative in nature, and everybody kind of has to be inside the tent. Not necessarily helping to build it, but helping to shape it, refine it, and understand it. Because if there's greater understanding, education throughout different groups and organizations, then there's more of a willingness to support. And I think it has more legs on it when you are able to do things like that. So I think just the support of being able to, different groups and organizations to meaningfully and willingly participate, because at the end of the day, what we're doing is putting into implement something that to date has been not theoretical, but more based on theory, and is now being put into application and trying to make it almost mainstream and scaling it. So it's really the support of all different sectors, different players, I guess, that are within the tent, the NGOs, the regulators, supply chain members, to be able to, understand and work with producers and understand the various needs and challenges and help to alleviate those, whether it's, grower incentives or data requirements or regulatory changes, or certainly measurement and data science gaps. So I think everybody can help play a role. It's just a matter of where and how and when those roles are needed.
Great, thanks. One of the phrases that when you were talking there, Mike, that popped to mind was a former boss of mine used to say, well, let's get the plane in the air and then we'll fix it. So we got the plane in the air. Michelle, do you want to provide some additional perspectives around support from the other players that are needed? Because I think Mike nailed it. But again, I think this is a real opportunity for us in ag and for everybody on the planet.
Yeah, Steve, I think Mike did a great job covering that question. The one thing I would say, when I thought of the word support, was I was thinking financial support. And I would say that there is a big investment that's being made by everyone in the supply chain in terms of time and resources and funding. And sometimes without having that end goal, the completion of that, known right now, because there's so much changing in the space in terms of how do we account for greenhouse gas reductions or soil carbon sequestration. There's a lot of unknowns. And so I'm going to go back to, I'm quite inspired because I do see a lot of investment by everyone in the supply chain to try to answer these questions, and big financial investments being made without clearly knowing how we're going to get that high integrity outcome in a way that suits the agricultural production system. So my, I guess, kind of final message on this, Mike, you did a great job answering it. I would just look for other partners to step into projects if they have an interest in this space. I think that the opportunity for partnership with ourselves as well as with others in this space is really wide open right now, as we're all trying to build together to figure out how to make this work.
So Mike's tent is even bigger than what Mike thought it was. So that's a good way to move to I'm going to end with the last question to Candace. And with what's happening right now that makes you really optimistic for the future?
Well, I think, given the urgency around the need for climate action and the awareness that, agriculture and the whole food and ag value chain plays a role in the globe's emissions profile. So we're part of the problem. But what makes me really optimistic and excited is there's a lane open for us and a invitation to deliver solutions, if not excitement from global stakeholders and a real interest in nature-based or natural climate solutions And that really is meaningful for me because being a farm kid from Saskatchewan and having a family that farms, I've had many moments where I felt the world has turned its back on agriculture, or just been really hard on agriculture, or not understanding agriculture and just wanting to tell growers to farm a certain way, but not understanding, to Michelle's point, how production in agriculture actually works. So I see a lane opening up where there's an understanding that we need to keep growers at the center of our efforts and engage, and understanding what works at the farm level and fundamentally what works in our soils as an asset, and how do we leverage that asset as a carbon sink. And so that means soil, farms, growers can be heroes delivering solutions, not just, beaten up with a stick all the time, which I'm sure many have felt as such in past years. So that's what I'm most optimistic about, is there is a lane open up and an open invitation for us to deliver on solutions. The challenge is, can we bring those solutions to market and to growers fast enough to capitalize on the opportunity that we believe is just around the corner of them being able to participate in a global voluntary carbon market.
Terrific. I like the natural solution, because Nutrien and others are engaging growers to take advantage of nature's proven carbon sequestration technology, photosynthesis. And I think this is a wonderful opportunity. I want to thank all of you for participating on the panel, and the leadership that you're showing in helping build this opportunity for agriculture and food here in Canada and globally. So thank you very much for participating in the PERC panel. And this has made our symposium this year better than it was last year. So thank you, everybody, for participating.